Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is Happy Birthday FDR, The Life and Times of America's 32nd President. And it's being presented by the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It is a free series we put on every year from January through April. This is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are going to be recorded and archived on our YouTube channel. We keep all the recordings of our programs there so that teachers and students can access them later. We're super excited to have you. We want you to participate as much as possible. So if you haven't already, go ahead and find your chat box. It looks like a little caption bubble. We'd love for you to share where you are and what grade you are if you haven't already. That'll be the primary way we participate today. If you would like to be on video, that's also an option. Go ahead and put something in the chat and I can work on making that happen for you. Otherwise, just be really respectful of our interactive tools. We want to make sure that any questions we're asking, any comments we're making, that they're all directly related to what our presenter is speaking about today. All right, I just want to thank you one more time. We are really excited to have you joining us. This is our website if you're interested in learning more about our upcoming programs, which, as I mentioned, go all the way through April, every Tuesday and Thursday. Or if you are interested in looking at some of the recordings, you can find that information there as well. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and hand you over to Mr. Urban, who you all came to see.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Therese. I'm delighted to be here. Happy almost the end of January. As you can see, it's a special day around here in Roosevelt land. It is Franklin Roosevelt's 142nd birthday. If he had just taken a little bit better care of himself, he would be 142 years old today. Well, obviously, he probably wouldn't have made it. He actually passed away when he was 63 years old, which is actually pretty young when you think about lifespans and such. But we are here today to talk a little bit about his birthday, a little bit about his childhood, a little bit about him and the challenges that he faced as he grew up. And we are just delighted to have you here. So I'm speaking to you from this building, which is the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. You can go to our website and find out a lot more information about us. And this is the building that we house the president's library in and also the president's papers. So in this building, which looks like a two-story building, it's actually a four-story building. There's one story completely underground, and then this is the main floor, and then there's two stories up here. So it's actually 4 stories tall. Inside this building, we have 17.5 million pages of documents. That would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other. So if you're looking for primary source documentation about the Roosevelt Presidential Library, we are the place to come. Also in this building, we have about 35,000 museum objects that related to the Roosevelt era. And we have about 50,000 books in the president's library. 23,000 of those books were actually his in his lifetime. The other 30,000 or so we've added since that time. So again, if you're looking for resources, students, if you're looking for information about homework assignments and things that relate to the Roosevelt era, please visit our website and you can find lots of information there about that. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to our YouTube page, but we have a little video there, and the video is called the Roosevelt Rap. And if you listen to the Roosevelt Rap, it goes a little something like this. A long time ago, in 1882, a baby was born, known to me and to you. His mother called him Franklin. His father called him son. He grew up destined for Washington. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a.k.a. FDR, born along the river in the town of Hyde Park. And that's what we're talking about today. You want to hear more of that, or maybe you don't want to hear more of that, but if you do want to hear more of that, you can go to our website. And Franklin Roosevelt was born on this very day, January 30th, 1882, and the country and the world would never be the same again. Now, this is 2024, so that does make him 142. And, he lived a very full life. He did a lot of things, went a lot of places. And again, we're going to talk about that today. So let's start off talking about his birth. Now, here is a copy of his birth announcement. Now, if you look at this, you can see a lot of information. Okay? So if you look at this, I think you could make this out. You can see that Franklin Roosevelt, what was Franklin's middle name? This is his birth announcement that his dad sent out. So what was Franklin's middle name? Can anybody make it out from where you are? Right here, right, Delano. So we know that it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Delano was actually his mother's maiden name. And if you go down here, you can see January 30th, 1882. And if you go down here, you can see that his parents were Mr. and Mrs. James Roosevelt. Now, that's the information that we have that's printed sort of on here. Then his dad wrote on here two other things. He wrote Hyde Park, New York, up here on the actual stork. And down here, he wrote the initials FDR. So by looking at this one birth announcement, we can know that Franklin Roosevelt, we know what his middle name is, we know what his birthday is, we know who his parents were, we know where he was born, and we know that he got his nickname FDR as a little teeny baby. So I like to show this to students because it shows you just how much information you can get, right? If you are looking for information about the Roosevelts from this one page, you know where he lived, what his middle name is, birthday, his parents, and his nickname. And if you could learn all of that from one document, imagine what you can learn from 17.5 million pages of documents. Now, this was sent out again by his dad. FDR doesn't have a formal birth announcement, a birth certificate, because he was born at home. And back in those days, if you were born at home, you didn't necessarily get a birth certificate. Here is a picture of Franklin with his mom. Okay. And so this is Franklin with his mommy. And you can see that he's dressed in kind of a sort of it's like a dress almost, right? It's called a kilt. And this is the way fancy people dress their kids. So FDR, until he was about 8 years old, would wear this little outfit, not around the house necessarily, but if he was going around to any place out in public and that sort of stuff, then this is what he would wear. And it was fancy folks that wore these sorts of things. And you can see here's a picture of his mom, right? And she's holding his hand, right? So these are a very loving relationship that we have here. We'll get back to that in a second. Now, here's a picture of FDR as a little teeny weeny baby, and he's with his dad. Now, what's interesting about this picture is if you look at this, doesn't this guy look maybe almost more like a grandpa than a dad? Right, here's FDR, a little baby, and here's this guy that looks maybe, I don't know, almost like he could be a grandpa. Well, this is FDR's dad. And FDR's father had been married once before to a woman by the name of Rebecca Howland, and she passed away. And then he married Sarah, FDR's mom. So Franklin's father was actually 27 years older than his mother. And so that's why you see the sort of the age difference here with the two of these folks. Okay, but that's a pretty darn cute baby, don't you think? That little Franklin Roosevelt there. I haven't seen a baby that cute since I was home at Christmas time visiting my mom, looking at baby pictures of me. So Franklin was born here on the property. He was born in the house that's here right next door to the Presidential Library. His father was a wealthy gentleman who was involved in railroad trade at the time. The railroads were the big thing, right? Today we have the internet getting information and stuff around. And Amazon, but in his day, it was railroads. So you could think of that as being like the big industry at the time. And his mother was a young woman who was a Delano, and the Delanos used to sail around the world, and they also had a fortune. So Roosevelt's parents were very wealthy. Franklin's father was wealthy from his work in the railroad industry, and his mother, Sarah, was very wealthy from the Roosevelt family, which did a lot of shipping and a lot of transportation and things around the world. Now, when Franklin was born 142 years ago today, it was a very difficult birth. And in fact, he almost didn't survive. Sarah was in labor for many, many hours, and Franklin was a big baby. He weighed 10 pounds when he was born. Go home and ask your mom how much you weighed, and then tell her that Franklin Roosevelt weighed 10 pounds. And I guarantee you, she's going to say, wow, right? That's a big baby. And so she went into labor here on the property, and she wasn't doing very well. So they sent for a doctor. The doctor came and tried to, relieve her stress from, being in labor. And he administered a chemical called chloroform. Now, usually you use that when you want to, kidnap somebody or knock somebody out, right? But he did this to relax Sarah, and he in effect almost killed FDR. FDR was born not breathing. So the doctor took quick action and did basically mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on FDR, got him breathing again, and then he went from the basically blue color to the cute little baby pink color that babies are supposed to be. Now, because of this made his mother believe that he was, in fact, what she called a miracle baby, because he almost didn't make it, right? He almost didn't survive. And so what happened was they became very close. Now, back in those days, very often women would use nurses, and they would use like aides and things like that would take care of the baby, right? Especially if you're wealthy. So, Sarah has the baby, but then the nurse comes in and takes care of her. And then Sarah just spends a little time with the baby here and there. But it would be the nurse that would feed the baby and, change the baby and all that sort of stuff. But that's not what Sarah wanted. Sarah, because FDR almost didn't make it, Sarah wanted to do all that stuff for Franklin herself. And so what this did was it created a very strong bond between Franklin and his mother. And so his relationship with his mom was very, very close and very, very tight. And, she considered him to be, again, this miracle baby. Now, this had an important impact on Franklin because he had this mother who gave him totally uncalibrated love, right? Anything he wanted, he got. He was the apple of her eye. And so Franklin grew up actually kind of spoiled, really. And his father thought the world of him as well. In fact, he wrote in his diary, "At 8:45, my Sally," that was Sarah's nickname, "had a splendid large baby boy. He weighs 10 pounds without clothes." And because of the difficulty in the birth, the doctor said, "Well, if I were you, I wouldn't have any more kids." So Franklin Roosevelt became really the center of the world of James and Sarah Roosevelt. And this, again, had a very important concept on an impact on him, because what it did was it made him very confident, right? He grew up in an incredibly loving environment where everything he wanted, he got. Anything he needed, he had. And in a lot of ways, it raised him to be a little bit spoiled, but it also raised him to be incredibly confident. And Sarah instilled in him a love of certain things. She instilled in him a love of books. And she saved all of his baby books. And in fact, he began to be a book collector. As I said, we have 23,000 books in his book collection that we have here. So he read books all the time, and she was always getting him books. She started him off on a stamp collection, and he collected stamps from all over the world. And this was his hobby. So he had stamps from all over the world. And when he finally put them all together, and he collected stamps all the way through his life, when he finally put them together, he had over 1 million stamps in his stamp collection. And There was 150 bound volumes of his stamps, over 1 million stamps. And when FDR studied stamps, he studied them not for their value, right? Some people collect stamps for their value, and then it's like an investment. But FDR studied stamps because of who was on them. Roosevelt understood that if there was somebody on a stamp in a country, that person must be important. And so he would study about that particular person. Or if there was a building, or if there was a monument or something like that, President Roosevelt, or little baby Roosevelt, young Roosevelt, would study about, well, what happened in that building? What happened where, they built that monument? Who is this guy? Who is this gal? And because of that, he gained a great deal of experience about geography around the world. And in fact, during the Second World War, when the United States was fighting the war all around the entire globe, the generals were kind of worried at first, like, oh, we got to tell the president where these little villages are in Europe or where these little islands are in the Pacific. And very often, Franklin Roosevelt knew more about those places than the generals did, because he had studied them through these stamps, and he understood people's culture and he understood people's history better than most folks would, in that day. And it all came from his studying of stamps. He read a lot of books. As I said, he wasn't a cover-to-cover book reader. He was what we call a spot reader. So he would pick up the book, he would read the sections that he thought were interesting. If he got to a part he didn't like, he'd skip through, and then he would go on to the next section from there. So he was a spot reader and picked up a lot of information along the way. Let me show you. Here is a copy of his report card from Groton School. Now, at first, he was tutored here on the property by European tutors. His parents, right, they were going to give him anything he wanted, so they wanted him to have a great education. So they hired tutors from Europe to come to the United States and tutor Franklin until he was 14 years old. So he was homeschooled, basically, until he was 14. Then he went to Groton School, and you probably can't make this out, but this is a copy of his report card. You can go to our website and you can download it. It's there. And you'll see that he mostly got B's and C's in his as grades in his subjects. And this is because if Franklin liked something, he would study it really, really hard. But if he didn't like it so much, he wouldn't study it so much, right? Maybe you have like a favorite subject that you work really hard in, and then you have other subjects that you don't really work as hard in because they're not of interest to you. Franklin Roosevelt was the same exact way. Now, let me see if it looks like we're getting some messages in here. Let me take a look at some of these questions here. Let's slide down. Let's see. Do you have a favorite book or something special you collect? Oh, Teresa, understand that. It's a lot of stamps. Yep, collecting books. Great. Little Women's series. Absolutely. Very cool. That's fair. Let's see. Great pick. Okay. So what we've got basically is Roosevelt teaching himself a lot of things through his hobbies. He also loved the ocean. He loved the seas. He loved the water. And this comes from his mom's side of the family, the Delanos. They were world travelers. In fact, they did a lot of trade. They had ships that they would send all across the country. They were based in Massachusetts and New York, and they would travel not all across the country, all around the world. So they would go to India, they would go to China, they would go to South America, and they would pick up items there and bring them back and sell them and transport things back and forth. So they made a lot of money through shipping. And this was a really tough way to make a living back in those days, of course, right? Because, you're sailing on the ocean. It takes you 3 months to get across. There's storms and all that sort of stuff. So Roosevelt loved to hear about his ancestors, the Delanos, and all the challenges that they faced as they went along and as they went around the world. So the love of sea he gets from his parents, from his mother, especially her side. The love of stamps and the interesting information about geography he gets from the learning about the stamps, and he gets a wide variety of history by reading a wide variety of books. Now, up until Franklin was about 9 or 10 years old, his dad was his favorite playmate. Right? There wasn't a lot of kids. He didn't have any older brothers or sisters or younger brothers and sisters. It was just him. And there was really nobody on the property to play with. The Roosevelts had a huge estate here in Hyde Park. It was about 3,200 acres. Okay, that's a huge chunk of property. And they didn't really have any neighbors per se. And most of the people that Franklin Roosevelt knew were people who worked on his family's estate. So it was a working farm, right? There were farm fields and things. So there were farmers that lived on the property and farmed the land. There was blacksmiths, there were carpenters, all these kinds of folks that need to have an estate, to make an estate work. It's kind of like almost like a kingdom, really, right? With the Roosevelts being the king and the queen and the rest of the folks there to sort of keep the estate working. So there weren't a lot of little kids for Franklin to play with. So his best friend was his dad up until he was 9 or 10 years old. Now, when Franklin was 10, his father had a heart attack and then became very weak and very, very frail, and he was no longer able to play with Franklin. And in fact, Franklin was only 18 years old when his father died. And he was a grown man. He was 60 years old when his mother died. So his mother lived well into her 80s, and his father lived into his 70s. But it was only when Franklin was 18 that his father passed away. But from the time he was born to the time he was 9 or 10, Franklin's father did everything with him. He taught him how to swim. He taught him how to sail. He taught him how to fish. He taught him how to hunt. In fact, he gave Franklin a gun when Franklin was about 10 years old. And he said, okay, you know what? Because this is how it was done back in the olden days. When you wanted to study birds, you would shoot a bird, and then you would take the bird and you would have it stuffed, and then you could measure its beak and its wings and all that sort of stuff. That's not how it's done today. It's called taxidermy. Back then, it's what it's called today as well. But you usually don't do that kind of stuff today, right? You look it up on the internet or a book or whatever. But that wasn't necessarily the way back in the day. So Franklin's father said, you can have this gun and you can shoot one type of bird, right? Only one type of each species, and you cannot do it during nesting season. So there's no reason to go out and shoot 5 robins. You only need to shoot one and then have it taxidermed, have it stuffed, and then you can study it from there. And so Franklin did that. And in fact, he collected a book. He wrote a little, like a notebook, field book about that. And he created the most complete book of birds of Dutchess County for that period that exists today. He was so good at studying those birds. He also taught Franklin how to ride horses. And one day, they had this 3,200 acre estate, right? So Franklin and his father would go out on horseback and they would ride around the estate and they would talk to the farmer and they would talk to the carpenter and here's the blacksmith. And, he would go around and meet with all the people on the farm. And one day Franklin was riding his pony a little too hard. He was being mean to his horse. He's, come on, horse, you got to keep going. You got to move along. Excuse me there. And what ended up happening was Franklin's father said, Franklin, you get off that horse right now and you walk him back to the barn. Clean him, brush him, feed him, and I'll talk to you when I get home. And so he made Franklin get off the horse, and Franklin had to walk the horse all the way back to the barn. He gave him his bath, he brushed him down, he gave him his food. And when his father came back, his father said, I don't want you ever, ever to treat an animal or a person like that again. That animal has feelings. That animal has rights. That animal has, the right to, be treated and taken care of appropriately. So from Franklin's father, Franklin learned some very important lessons. He learned to have a love of the land. He learned to have a love of the property. He learned to have a love of trees and water and, the plants and animals that lived on that property. And as a result of that, he became a very important environmental president. If you remember, he was president during the Dust Bowl, so he understood the problems that the farmers were going through. The Dust Bowl was a time when there was a big drought, and so the land dried out, and you couldn't grow anything on it. Franklin, because he grew up on a farm, because he talked to the farmers that lived here, he understood the problems that they were going through, and he understood how to handle those problems and how to approach some of those problems. So Franklin learned to get along well with people and to talk with people through his father. And he learned how to take care of people and respect people through his father. And he learned a lot of his sort of book learning through his mom as well. Now, there are very few details about Franklin's birthdays growing up, but you can pretty much bet he got, whatever he wanted. So here is a picture of him again as a baby. Now, in this picture, you're going to notice here in this picture, you're going to notice that he is wearing basically a smock. Okay, that's not a wig. That's not a wig, Lakewood, but that's great observation. Again, back in those days when you were born and you were in a wealthy family, you wore your hair long until you were about 7 or 8 years old, and you wore these sort of smocks, kind of like a dress. So this is Franklin Roosevelt. He's about 4 years old here. And in about another 3 years or so, he'll get his hair cut and he'll switch over from the smock over to that little kilt I was showing you a minute ago. And this is the way fancy people dressed back in those days. So to see this picture of him, you can see that he was really pretty wealthy and pretty well taken care of. Somebody asked, Stephen asked, didn't he always list his occupation as tree farmer? That is exactly right. Even though Franklin Roosevelt was wealthy, he became the president, he became the governor, he was the assistant secretary of the Navy, he was in the New York State Senate, he always listed his job, his occupation, as Dutchess County tree farmer because he grew trees here on the property. When his father passed away, the estate went to his mother, and Franklin, because he was the only child, stayed here, basically lived with his mother until he got married, and then he lived in Albany, which is our state capital, and he was the governor in Albany, and then, of course, he was president in Washington, D.C., but he always used this home here that he grew up in as his base of operations. And on the 3,200 acres, he grew all sorts of trees. He grew experimental forests, and he also grew Christmas trees. In fact, he grew pine trees, spruce trees, Douglas fir, and then he would sell those in department stores in New York City for a profit. And then he also grew other hardwoods here on the property as well. So he used the property as kind of like a little laboratory to practice forestry. And again, he got this from this love of the land that he learned from his dad. Here is a picture of Franklin and his mom and dad when Franklin was about 18. You can see how his father has really aged quite a bit there. Okay, and there's his mom. So there's a 27-year difference in age between Franklin's dad and Franklin's mom. Okay, 27 years. And so you see that depicted there in that picture as well. Now, when Franklin was getting ready to go off to school, his mother didn't want him to go off to school. She wanted him to stay here on the property and continue to be homeschooled. But he was, he wanted to get out. He wanted to be with kids his own age. So they sent him off to Groton School, and that was where his formal schooling education began. Kind of like you guys are in school now as well. And let me show you some other pictures of him. Here he is again in that kilt. All right, Mr. Fancy. Here he is in his riding outfit, right? So again, we're talking when he does stuff, it's not like he's just, oh yeah, he gets a hobby. He throws himself into it. His parents, get him everything he's looking for to go along with that hobby. Well, when he showed an interest in sailing, here he is in a sailor outfit. So he had a little boat called the Half Moon. It was a little sail, and he was here. And he would sail on the Hudson River, and he would dress in his little suit here, his little sailor suit there as well. When he showed an interest in archery, guess what? He got a complete archery set and a complete archery kit. And here he is with that. When he showed an interest in photography, There it is, right? His parents went out and bought him a state-of-the-art camera. Now, this is a state-of-the-art. This was the most advanced camera you could get at that time. I'm not exactly sure what kind it was, but again, because they were wealthy, this would be like you showing an interest in, let's say, a computer or something, and your mom and dad going out and buying you the best computer with the best printer and a scanner and, all the rest of that sort of stuff, right? Probably your parents aren't in a position to be able to do that, but they could with Franklin. Now, there's a question, didn't he have a brother named Rosie? Yes, he did, but Rosie was his half-brother. Remember I said that James had been married once before? He was married to a woman by the name of Rebecca Howland, and they had a son, and the son's name, believe it or not, was Roosevelt. And so that's why they called him Rosie. So that was FDR's half-brother, who was as old as Franklin's mother. So Franklin's half-brother, Rosie, was really more like a parent figure to Franklin growing up than he was a brother. And Rosie, not too many people know about him. He kept a very low profile. He liked to raise trotting horses, and he would race those and he would sell those. And that's the way he kept his part of the money going. But Franklin decided to get involved in politics. So after he graduated from Groton School, he then went to Harvard. And then he graduated from Harvard. And he went to law school at Columbia Law School, but he didn't actually ever graduate. What he did was he took courses, and then he took the bar exam, like the big exam to see if he could be a lawyer, and he passed that, so he never bothered to get his actual law degree. And so what he did was he went into working for law for a little while, but he didn't really like it. Roosevelt, he wanted to get things done. He wanted to make things happen. And law was simply too slow for him. So that's when he decided to get into politics. And he ran for the state Senate here in New York for the district that he lived in. And he became a state senator. And he moved to Albany, and he lived there and worked there as a state senator. While he was state senator, he became involved in the Democratic Party and what they call the political machine. And what that is, it's kind of like, it's like the machine is kind of like, they're part of the Democratic Party, and they're the ones that make all the decisions. They're kind of like the cool kids, right, of the Democratic Party. And Franklin becomes one of these cool kids. And what he does is he puts Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination for the presidency. And when Woodrow Wilson wins and becomes president, he appoints Franklin Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Roosevelt loves this, right? Because remember, he loves the Navy from growing up as a Delano, right? And all his seafaring relatives and such. So he becomes the number 2 guy in the Navy, and he's there during the First World War. And so during the First World War, Roosevelt is responsible for sending all the ships and supplies and the materials over to Europe to help fight the First World War. And this becomes a really important dress rehearsal for him for later on when he becomes president during World War II. Because when he becomes president during World War II, he's now in charge of World War II, and he's got to get troops and ships and things, not only from the United States to Europe to fight the war, but also from the United States to the Pacific Rim. So being the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War was a great little dress rehearsal for him. Then after that term was over, he was getting ready to really enter into politics, and then he suddenly caught a disease called polio. And he was 39 years old when he caught polio, and he was never able to walk again. So he designed his own wheelchair, and here is a model of it right here. And if you look at this wheelchair, what you'll notice is it's got the big wheels in the front and the little wheels in the back. And it's nothing more really than a kitchen chair that the legs have been cut off of, and it's been put on a metal frame with the wheels. Notice that there's no arms here, right, on the chair. So he's able to get from into this chair, wheel himself to where he wants to go, and then slip off into a more comfortable chair. Franklin Roosevelt designed this chair himself. He sketched it out, gave it over to a carpenter and a metal worker, and they created this based upon his sketch. And he liked this because it's very narrow, and he's able to get from point A to point B. Now, when he sat on this, he was sitting right on his butt bone, right? Because polio is a disease that is a disease that impacts your muscles, not your nerves. So he was able to feel his legs, but he wasn't able to move them. So when he sat, he was sitting right on his butt bone, which was very uncomfortable. So he would only use this chair to get from one spot to the other, and then he would slide into a more comfortable chair. You'll notice also on here, this little circle here, this little round thing, that's not a cup holder, that's an ashtray. FDR was a big time smoker, and today he's dead. Keep that in mind, okay? So he didn't let the polio stop him. He came up with ways to continue on doing what it was that he wanted to do. He would wear leg braces so that he could lock those leg braces and stand up, and he would use this wheelchair to get from one place to the other. And then in 1932, he decided to run for the presidency, and the country was in the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed. People were out of work. People didn't have jobs. People were literally starving in the United States. And Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, just wasn't doing enough to get things to be better. And so Franklin Roosevelt said, well, I'm going to run for president. Now, at the time he decided to run for president, he was the governor of New York State. And he spent the first 4 years of the Great Depression as governor of New York State. And so many of the New Deal programs that we think about, many of the New Deal programs that you've probably heard about or are going to learn about, were actually started out as small experiments here in New York State first. And then when he became president, he turned those into what we call the New Deal. So this was a second dress rehearsal for Franklin Roosevelt to learn some skills, right? He was running the state of New York, which was the largest state in the Union at the time. And, you know, he's doing these job programs, doing these ideas with economics and things, and they were kind of working here in New York. He said, you know what, let me take those to the national level. And he defeated President Hoover, and he became president in 1932. And he started a thing called the New Deal. And the New Deal was over 44 programs. You ever seen that periodic table of science, right? The periodic table of the elements? Well, we have one for FDR, periodic table of the New Deal. And there were over 44 programs of the New Deal, and they were all designed to help bring about three things: relief, recovery, and reform, right? Relief, recovery, and reform. How do we help out people today that are hungry, that don't have enough food, that don't have enough warm clothes or a place to sleep? How do we bring about relief to them? How do we bring about recovery? How do we get people back on the farms, back in the factories, right? Back in the schools? And then third, how do we prevent this from happening again? Reform. How do we prevent another stock market crash? How do we prevent another Great Depression? And Franklin Roosevelt ended up using these New Deal programs to build thousands of buildings across the country, miles and miles of roads. He built seaports, airports, parks, sidewalks, roads, water lines, electric lines, sewer lines. In fact, about half the infrastructure that was built in this country was built during the Great Depression through the New Deal programs. So he decides, okay, we're going to get people working again, and we're going to create all these programs in order to do that. How did he know they were going to work? Because he had tried some of them in small experiments here in New York State first. Then, toward the end of his second term, Adolf Hitler starts the Second World War. And now the United States is trying to stay out of the war, but Hitler is doing everything he can to try to take over the world. And so Franklin Roosevelt says, well, we don't want any part of this, and we're going to try to stay out of this, and we're going to try to help England. And what ends up happening is Germany's ally, Japan, attacks the United States at Pearl Harbor, right? And that gets us into the war. And now Franklin Roosevelt becomes the leader of the Allies during the Second World War. And he uses that experience that he learned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War to help him understand how to get troops and machines and materiel to places that they need to get to. He also uses his understanding of world geography that he's learned through the study with all of the stamps about where all these places are in the world. And he understands what the people in those countries are like because he studied them through the stamps as well. And you've seen that periodic table of the elements for science. I just showed you the periodic table for the elements of the New Deal. And we also have one for World War II, because World War II was a big deal. 60 million people killed during the Second World War. Now, this had a big impact on Franklin Roosevelt because he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, where 16 million people were killed. And then he becomes the president during the Second World War, where 60 million people are killed. Roosevelt understands that there cannot be a third world war, that with atomic weapons, with the mass destruction of the Second World War, if we have another third world war or a third world war, then it's going to be a really bad one, and hundreds of millions of people will die. And so in order to prevent this from happening, President Roosevelt creates an organization called the United Nations. And the United Nations was formed to try to get people talking about their problems as opposed to shooting about them and fighting about them. And the United Nations has been very effective, and now so far over 80 years, we haven't had a third world war. And Roosevelt wanted to leave this as part of his legacy. So you've got this guy who was born 142 years ago today. He grows up as kind of a spoiled guy, getting whatever he wants, but he's learning the whole way. He's learning about science. He's learning about biology. He's learning about the land. He's learning about people. He's learning about geography. He's learning all of these things. And then he ends up starting a career in politics. He goes to Albany as a state senator, gets connected with the cool kids, and puts Woodrow Wilson's name in nomination. Woodrow Wilson ends up helping him out by appointing him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then Roosevelt gets polio. He says, oh my gosh, but it's not going to stop me. I'm going to keep on going. And he keeps on going. He becomes the governor of the state of New York. He uses his experience there to gain some experience that he then, when he becomes president in 1932, he uses those experiences to help create the New Deal programs, which get us through the Great Depression. And then he leads us through the Second World War, defeating the Nazis, creating the United Nations. And then on April 12th, in 1945, at the age of 63, he suffers a stroke and dies. But all of that in that 63-year lifespan, and it all began 142 years ago today. Now, somebody's asking, what was that like the League of Nations? Yes. In fact, Woodrow Wilson, right, was one of FDR's mentors, and Woodrow Wilson had the idea of a League of Nations after the First World War, but it wasn't put together properly. It didn't work. The United States didn't join, and there wasn't a real mechanism for getting things done. And so Franklin Roosevelt said, well, I'm going to learn from that. And when we build the United Nations, we are going to have mechanisms that will make it work. We're going to have mechanisms that are going to be able to have it be effective. And, you know, the United Nations isn't always as effective as we'd like it to be in terms of stopping aggression, but it's helped to feed people all around the world. It's helped to solve diseases all around the world. And it has given people a place to turn and a place for hope when there are problems internationally. And most importantly, it has prevented there from being a third world war. So let me go up here. I think I missed a couple of questions. Okay. All right, so let's see. Was FDR raised in a specific faith? Was he religious as an adult? Yes, FDR was raised as a Protestant, and he was very religious. He was very spiritual. And if you read his speeches, if you read his, his work, he is constantly making references to two things. He's constantly making references to the Bible, and he's constantly making references to baseball. So he was a very religious man, and he uses a lot of biblical references in his talks. Let's see, he was a Democrat, and he was a Democrat because his parents raised him sort of to be Democrats, and he had a cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a Republican. And so in order to differentiate himself from that Roosevelt, he liked to stay with the Democrats because he thought, okay, this is, Teddy's the Republican Roosevelt, I'm the Democratic Roosevelt. Let's see. He never served in the military except as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, right? So he's number 2 man in the Navy. And of course, he was Commander in Chief, right? Led the entire World War. Let's see. Why did he design his own wheelchair? Because at the time, wheelchairs were big. And they were like more like porch furniture, right? Big, cumbersome things that were hard to get around. And so instead, he wanted that sort of much nimbler thing that he was able to work around with. Did he have something to help him walk? He would use canes and leg braces. Let's see. Any other questions? Was he related to Theodore Roosevelt? Yes, Theodore Roosevelt was a distant cousin. And then he became, Theodore Roosevelt's niece was Eleanor Roosevelt. So he became Franklin Roosevelt's uncle-in-law, if that makes any sense to you. Did he know Teddy Roosevelt? In fact, he did know Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was one of his heroes. Teddy Roosevelt was somebody that he modeled himself after. Oh, his favorite baseball team, the Washington, what the heck were they? The Senators, the Washington Senators. And he said that all the time because, of course, he lived in Washington. He didn't want to pick a favorite baseball team across the country because then that would be picking favorites. So he always used his hometown team, the Washington Senators, as his favorite. Let's see. FDR's mother was 28 when he was born, and his father was well into his 50s. I think he was like 50, 58 or close to 60. How was he related to Eleanor before he was married? They were 5th cousins once removed. What does that mean? It means if you go back 5 generations of Roosevelts, there were 2 brothers, and the brothers went off, and one started the Roosevelt family of Teddy Roosevelt, and the other started the Roosevelt family of Theodore Roosevelt. And it took almost 200 years for that to happen. So they have a very distant relative 5 generations back. Let's see. Oh, his last resting place, great question, is right here on site. So he has a little cemetery here with him, his wife Eleanor, and their little dog Fala are buried right here on the property. So it just shows you how much he loved this place. He was born here, he lived here, he returned here as often as he could, and then he was buried here when he passed away. He met Eleanor when they were little kids. The Roosevelts were famous for their family reunions, and they would have these family reunions every couple of years. And so Franklin and Eleanor actually first met when Franklin was 4 and Eleanor was 2, and they met at a family reunion. And it wasn't until they became grown-ups, until he was 19 and she was 18. I'm sorry, he was 20 and she was 18, that they fell in love and started dating. Yes, the house is called Springwood. That's the name of the house. Then they met again at a ball, right? Well, they didn't meet at a ball. They kept meeting up at these family reunions over the course of their lives. And then what happened was Eleanor went to school in England for 3 years, and then they kind of lost track of each other for that 3 years. But when she came back, they met again in New York City, and they fell in love, and then they started dating from there. Okay. Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt had 5 kids that lived to be adults. They're all passed away now. They all went into various professions and things, businesses. Some were, one was a mayor of Miami, one was a congressman from California for a while there. One of them worked for an eyeglass company. So they had a nice varied career there as well. Let's see. Are there any pictures of Eleanor and FDR as little kids? Well, I just showed you some pictures of Franklin as a little kid. Here's another picture of him as a little kid. I don't have any pictures of Eleanor as a little kid with me, but if you go to our website and you look in the photos section, you will find 2,000 copyright-free photographs of the Roosevelts, and you can take a look at those there as well. So my goal today, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, was to share a little bit about the life of Franklin Roosevelt, who was born 142 years ago today, just about 100 yards from where I am sitting at this moment. He grew up to become one of the most influential presidents, not only of the 20th century, but of American history. And he also had a huge impact on the rest of the world because he was the president that led the coalition that defeated the Nazis, bringing the end of the Second World War, and then bringing in the relative period of peace after that time. So I hope you have enjoyed this. And if you'd like to learn more, please visit our website. And teachers, if you would like to have a copy of these periodic tables to hang in your classrooms, I know a guy that could get you a set for free. Shoot me an email, let me know your address, how many you need, and I'll get them in the mail to you right away. Okay? So go out and have yourself a piece of birthday cake today on Franklin Roosevelt. Thanks for having me in. Oh, my email, Therese, can you put that up? Do you know the?
Yep, I'll put it in.
Great, thanks so much. I would do it myself, but we'd be here for another 2 hours while I pecked it into the thing here. All right, so thank you guys. Have a great rest of the week.